Okay, I'm just watching the participant list climb. Good evening, everyone, and to our guests in Canada, a very good afternoon to you. Thank you, everybody, for joining the latest of our South Hampstead speaker series. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Vicky Bingham, the head of South Hampstead High School, and I'm delighted to welcome so many students from our partner schools, from our sister GDST schools, and lots of members of the GDST alumni network. Just three quick points of housekeeping before we start. Firstly, we'd recommend that you use speaker view rather than gallery view. Secondly, there will be time for questions after Mark and Diana have spoken. So please use the Q&A function to post questions either during the talk or afterwards. And thirdly, we are going to be recording this event, so bear with us in case of any technical issues. Hopefully there won't be any. So each term, the South Hampstead Speaker Series welcomes a high-profile guest speaker to talk about an interesting topic. And this is the first time, excitingly, that we've had a double act. Two economists, two environmentalists, and both with a strong connection to the Girls' Day School Trust. One is a GDST alumna. I'll let you guess which one. And both are parents of former GDST girls. So this evening, we're absolutely thrilled to welcome Mark Carney and Diana Fox Carney. The couple met when they were studying economics at the University of Oxford, which Diana attended after going to Oxford High School herself. And they now have four daughters, and two of their daughters attended South Hampstead High School until they returned to Canada. Both Mark and Diana have got distinguished careers, having worked across the world, and as such they bring a truly international perspective to some of the biggest global challenges facing all of us at the moment: credit, climate, and of course COVID. Diana's background is in development and climate policy, identifying paths towards a more inclusive economic system. She's worked for progressive think tanks, and she serves on the board of environmental and children's charities. Mark has been described as a rock star banker and one of the world's top economists. And after 7.5 years as governor of the Bank of England, he now serves as the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. And in January, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, appointed Dr. Carney as his finance advisor for the COP26 Climate Summit, due to take place in Glasgow later this year. And this evening, Diana and Mark will explore how financial values have come to dominate human values, where that leaves us, and what we might do about it in a post-COVID world. So Diana and Mark, a very warm welcome back to South Hampstead and to the GDST. And I'm going to hand over to you now, Diana.
Thank you so much, Vicky, and thanks to everyone who's joining us, spending your evening with us today. So I think we're going to start really by talking about the climate issues, and we can get into those other value issues as we go through. But what I'm going to do, and I know there's people on this call with very different levels of knowledge around climate and where we are with respect to the climate crisis. So what I'm going to do to begin with is just lay out some of the parameters of our situation before we get into a discussion, Mark and I, around how we might move forward, what the expectations are from COP, and how society's values in general inform our behavior in this space. So if you'll give me a few minutes just to give you a few facts, and forgive me if you know these already, but they are changing fast. There's been a lot of publicity in the last couple of weeks about Bill Gates's book around climate, which I will recommend to everyone. It is a very clear picture of where we are, but he talks about a number of 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases that are emitted annually. You'll also hear a number of 34 billion tons, which is the actual CO2, the carbon side. The rest of it is made up of other greenhouse gases, and we can talk a little bit about that. But both of those are critical numbers, and both of those are numbers that we have to reduce down to zero if we're going to stabilize our climate. So atmospheric CO2 levels are up 50% on pre-industrial levels. We've already risen by 1 degree approximately. And one of the key points in this whole discussion is that 1 degree is not 1 degree for everyone. It's very variable. And we see that in Canada, in the Arctic here, the temperature rise is much higher than in the Mediterranean. So it's almost twice as high in the northern region. So even though 1 degree, as you know, doesn't sound like much, it can be a huge amount, and we'll get into some of the impacts later on. But I think the critical thing is how far we are prepared to go as a society. There's been this target of 1.5 degrees. There is a 1 in 6 chance that we can't ever achieve that we've already exceeded that. And I think the key thing to have in mind is a carbon budget, which many of you will have heard about. If we are to maintain, everything is in the climate world is in probabilities, because our modeling doesn't enable us to be absolutely certain. But if we are to maintain a 66% chance, so that is not close to 100, but over 50% chance of staying within the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees, we only have somewhere between 230 and 440 billion tons of carbon dioxide left to emit. So that's between 6 and 11 years of our current emissions. And nothing is exact, but what we're talking about is a decade ahead of us, which is absolutely critical. We've left it too late, but we have this critical decade ahead of us in which we can hope that we will still be able to achieve 1.5 degrees warming as opposed to 2 degrees or further. And I think that hopefully you're all aware that we're not on that path right now. We're on a path to about 3.8 degrees or 4 degrees. Mark, you can come in later on that, but where we are now is not nearly where we need to be. We want to aim for 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees is much better than 2 degrees, even though it's half a degree difference. It implies that nearly 2 billion people more will experience severe heat waves under 2 degrees than they will under 1.5 degrees. Sea levels will rise another 10 centimeters, which has a grave impact for coastal inundation. Coral reefs are completely gone at 2 degrees. At 1.5 degrees, they are largely gone, but we could still retain some. And as I pointed out, there is much variability within the numbers. So, food production, disease, other things are much higher at 2 degrees than 1.5 degrees. So that's the kind of bad news, I guess, of where we are. I've been working in the climate and development space for nearly 2 decades. And at many times I felt like a voice crying in the wilderness on this topic. And despite all that bad news, I am more optimistic about our climate future now than I have been in years. And Mark can attest that there have been years of my life where I've been depressed about our possibility of change. But where we are now is a world that is in grave danger, but we are at least talking about it. We are addressing climate in a serious way. And over the past 12 months, so really during the pandemic, net zero, which is zero net carbon or greenhouse gas emissions, more stringently greenhouse gas overall, more loosely carbon emissions, has become part of the conversation. And at both a country level, a subnational level for cities and states, and importantly, at a business level, people are making pledges to achieve net zero alongside the UN target of 2050 for finally achieving that net zero, 2030 for getting halfway there, I guess. So we have nearly 130 countries that have made pledges in this space. And as of October 2020, there were over 1,500 corporations that had made net zero pledges. These need a lot of fleshing out, and that's something that Mark can talk about. But it is a very, very different place than we've been in for the preceding decades. And of course, as you know, just last Friday, the US rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. So in that regard, we are all gradually coming to the table and beginning to move in the same direction. So what we need now is a massive acceleration of effort and pace from everyone. We need countries, companies, investors, individuals, everyone to be pooling efforts. It's not a time to look for silver bullets. And we hear a lot about trees and soil carbon and carbon sequestration. The truth is right now we need everything all at once. We're not gonna save the planet by all becoming vegans. On the other hand, us becoming vegans will help save the planet. So we have to look at the measures we can all take individually at a corporate level and at a political level. And we can't waste any more time by passing the buck between us and blaming each other for not moving fast enough, nor can we see any sector of the economy opting out. Everyone, whether they're a small part of the economy or a large part of the economy, has to come alongside and do the utmost to enable us to achieve our goals. So it's a tempered optimism, but it is nonetheless optimism because there is a real sense of forward motion now. And that's the point at which I'm going to bring Mark in. And Mark, can you complement what I've said and perhaps begin to describe the changes that you've witnessed at a financial and corporate level in the last year, but also the last 5 years since this has become live?
Right. Hello, Diana. Thank you. And thank you, Vicky and South Hampstead and the GDSD for putting this together. And hello, everyone. Thank you for devoting some of your evening to this talk. Looking forward to your comments and questions. Look, a little more than 5 years ago, when I was governor, I raised this issue, particularly at Lloyd's of London, appropriately so, because actually that, of all the financial institutions in the city, was the most forward-looking on climate. And the reason was that many of the members of the syndicates faced those risks every day, and they were constantly having to update their models and their pricing, because what had been a low probability event in the speak of finance, in the tail of the distribution, consistently was moving to the center of the distribution, or the highest probability. So you had a threefold increase in extreme weather events over a few decades, and a fivefold increase in the cost of those, reaching into a couple of $100 billion per annum. So the point I made there was around the risks around climate change, both the physical risks, but very importantly, to get to what Diana was just speaking about, if we collectively, not just in the UK or Canada, but worldwide, we're going to respect our carbon budgets and ultimately limit the temperature increases consistent with Paris, that there would be a large number of stranded assets, and there would be a large rewiring, if you will, of every aspect of the economy, and that there were not just physical risks, therefore transition risks. I say all that by the point of, and I've got a lot of, let me say there was a robust set of comments around those remarks, even though they were directly on the core responsibilities of the bank as the supervisor of the insurance industry and the financial system. Part of the reason to raise that is 5 years ago, the conversation was largely around risk. So if it was appreciated, the conversation was more in the periphery. It was a corporate social responsibility discussion. Being a good corporate citizen as opposed to a business imperative, as I say, was more around the periphery. It was around risk. And what's happened over the course of the last 5 years, and I think really accelerated in the last 18 months and certainly the last 12 months, is all of those aspects have changed. So it's moved, if you will, from CSR, corporate social responsibility, to the C-suite, so the chief executive officers, one of the top 3 issues for companies. It is a core strategic issue, how well a company is positioned with respect to a transition to net zero. It is a mainstream conversation every day for business in finance. And then it has, and this is the positive point, which is it's turned from a business and finance perspective towards opportunity. So, and maybe we'll get into this, but seeing that as opinion is coalesced in broader society around the imperative of getting to net zero, it's become apparent that if you're part of the solution, you will create a lot of value and do well. So it's not just the downside, but it's very much the upside. So that's all of those aspects, periphery to center, CSR to C-suite, becoming strategic, and from risk to opportunity. Those are all sea changes. So I think it's hard to it's hard to overstate how much things have changed over the course of the last 5 years.
And thank you, Mark. I certainly agree with you. Where do we need to go from now? What more needs to happen to make this a reality?
Well, I think you said part of it in your comments, which is, in some respects, everything. There are no silver bullets, and for example, across energy, the solutions include wind, solar, new storage, ultimately hydrogen, direct air capture, hydropower. I mean, there's just a broad range of energy solutions that are necessary, and it's easy and natural to get captured by some, and of course, specialization is a good thing, but it requires across the piece. I think so. The first point, everything, which is an easy way to put it, but it's also true. Secondly, what we need to do is have this, which I think is happening, this focus on the end game. In some respects, this is straightforward in that it is about emissions. It's the emission stupid. It is ultimately about emissions coming down. And it's a question for companies and for financial institutions and obviously countries as a whole. What is the plan to bring those down, and how does aspiration get mapped into actual action to bring it down? I think, it won't surprise you to hear me say that I think this COP is incredibly important. It is a very good thing that the UK is leading the COP. The UK is leading the G7 this year. We are, in many respects, we are in partnership with Italy for this COP. Italy is leading the G20 this year. They've just put a central banker in charge of the government there, so that's also a good thing. But there's this opportunity with the momentum in the corporate sector and the financial sector, the push from society, and then if I can put it this way, the sort of way the governance is with UK leading COP, the G7, G20, and the US back at the table to really, really make progress. So the momentum here is great, but we need to accelerate it further.
So let's talk a little bit about COP, as you're revising the COP on the financial piece. But what are you aiming to bring to the table on the COP, and what would you aim for the COP to achieve?
Yeah, so there's two things, if I may. There's a sort of formal part of the COP process, which is largely, not exclusively, but largely intergovernmental. So every country is doing their homework, and it's a sort of revise and resubmit after Paris, because as you say, we're on a trajectory, 3.75 degrees. It's not what we collectively said that our objective was, which was sub 2 degrees, in fact 1.5. So every country is coming up with their NDC plan. What are they doing? And then we're going to add up all of those plans and give an objective assessment of whether or not it meets the objective, which is, again, sub 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees. And so there's a huge effort to raise the ambition, and there's a lot of progress being made. The UK, the 68% down objective that the government announced just before the holidays, very important, and followed up with plans and others. So, but let's see where that gets. So there are other things on the intergovernmental side. I won't go into all the details. The bit that I'm working on is the bit for the financial sector, and we have a very clear objective, which is that every financial decision takes climate change into account. And the objective, I've been around finance, every decision virtually in finance takes credit risk into account. Even if you're not lending someone money, if you're investing in a company's stock or others, you think about their creditworthiness. If you buy a government bond, you think about its creditworthiness to varying degrees. So we want financial institutions to have the information and the tools and the necessary markets. There's some missing markets here in order for that to be the case. It's built on disclosure and mandatory disclosure across the whole industry, but it's built on developing some new markets, like for carbon offsets. voluntary carbon offsets, but it's also oriented around, and I'll finish on this, which is around this orientation. It's anchored on this orientation towards net zero. So which companies have plans? If you're a bank, if you're an investor, an insurance company, pension fund, are your portfolios, your loans or your investments, are they consistent with the transition to net zero? And if not, what are you doing about it? And that should be as transparent to everybody on this call, everybody in society, be able to have the answers. The system has not been set up for that, and we're working to get the system set up for that. And of course, I said that was going to be my last point. I'm going to make one more, which is the interaction between what governments are doing, their policies, what society wants, consumer preferences, and that information and those tools. That can create a virtuous cycle, which is self-reinforcing, because if you have a plan to move towards net zero, then you're going to be backed with capital.
Indeed, it's I mean, I think this virtuous circle between emerging technologies, the finance piece, and the policies, and how they can all kind of reinforce each other. I think that's the place we hope that we're going to end up now. I'm going to switch tack a little bit. Mark, you have a book coming out in a couple of weeks. And there may be some people on this call who heard Mark give the Wreath lectures at the end of last year. The book is on the topic of values. Can you just describe how values and valuation, which is the tension that you describe in your book, how does that help inform our response? How did that help possibly get us into the climate crisis and help inform how we might get out of the climate crisis?
Yeah, thank you, thank you for asking about the book. But this is, this is the heart of it, and it really, the challenge is both how we got ourselves into the situation and how partly we can get ourselves out was the motivation for writing this. I think it starts from, look, there are. I'll speak for a moment like an economist. That was, by the way, before that was me speaking like my version of a normal person being. But you have there's sort of three challenges that get us into this. One is that there are market failures. So the tragedy of the commons. So you have overgrazing on common land or overfishing in the high seas. And that's a market failure. There's an externality. Somehow you price that externality. So price on carbon, or you change property rights. You put a fence around the land. Tragedy of the commons. The second issue, which is more about our human nature, is the tragedy of the horizon. We undervalue things in the future, and so the intergenerational equity of the climate crisis is very strong. So we're just not. We can see what's coming, but we're not taking all the actions we need to today to prevent the future problem. And we, unfortunately, with great wisdom of hindsight, that was obvious in with the pandemic, that virtually very few countries had done adequate preparations for a pandemic that wasn't just a concept, but was fully predicted. Climate, we don't get a do-over on climate. We get one shot at this. We can't self-isolate from the climate, so we need to take action. So tragedy of commons, tragedy of horizon. The third point, which is a core value point, is, and now again, speaking like an economist, but in the sort of sense of how these things get embedded in the way we make decisions, is very often decisions are trade-offs. It always brought into a trade-off framework. So the economy versus the environment. And so the cost of improving the environment versus the short-term impact on the economy. And the point is to turn that around. And this is what I believe has been happening, is that society, and we're speaking at South Hampstead and through GDSD, a number of those students would have been involved and still involved in Fridays for Futures. Their parents also involved in social movements around climate. People voting in that way, not just in the UK, but in other countries. Here in Canada, about 70% of the votes last election backed, very clear net zero policies from a variety of parties. And that changes things, the hierarchy of values. So the value is let's get to net zero. Let's address this. We've left it late, but let's address this. And then the economy serves, and the financial system serves that objective. And it's a bit of what I was saying earlier, which is that turns a risk into an opportunity. It actually turns it into a huge opportunity. And you see that everywhere in financial markets, or virtually everywhere in financial markets now, where the value of low or zero carbon solutions are many, many multiples of, if I can put it this way, and I think it is the right way to put it, old economy, high carbon solutions. And that is, I think that is only going to extend across markets. So that's part of how this relationship between value and values, it can be changed. And if it is changed, can be quite powerful. Very powerful, rather.
As you've described it, I mean, you've placed a caution around the ability of the market to enable or incent us to do the right thing. But you have also described now a world where, because there's a different approach, there are now opportunities around climate, and finance and companies are moving into this space because they view that as one of opportunity. Just wondering if you can comment on the relative importance of market movement and regulation or policy. How much can be voluntary and in response to opportunities, and how much has to be mandated? And
the typical central banker answer, the answer is both. Yes. Yes to that question, because you do need both, and they are self-reinforcing. And this is a point that actually Janet Yellen and I, who Janet is now obviously the Secretary of the Treasury, used to run the Federal Reserve in the US. We wrote a paper last fall, which I'll save everyone 85 pages of dense text. The punchline is exactly this, which is that if you have credible and predictable climate policy, so if you not just have a net zero objective, but you're actually putting in place a rising carbon prices, as we have in Canada, is rising to $170 in the next 10 years, or a moratorium on internal combustion engines, as has been put in place in the UK after 2030, well, that tells companies and investors and people where the economy is going. And the adjustment starts today. It doesn't wait until, car companies aren't going to wait till, auto companies won't wait till 2030 to say, oh, maybe we should have some electric vehicles. You see the shift. Interestingly enough, I think the EU measures and the UK measures around internal combustion engines have had an impact in North America, because what we're seeing is the North American car companies, including domestically, making huge changes to their model fleets that I think have been spurred by this type of predictable policy, because to some extent, where Europe goes and the UK go on climate, others will likely follow, not assuredly, but likely follow. So the point is that if you have predictability, and this of course holds as well for consumer preferences, if you know where people are going in terms of what they're willing to consume and willing to buy, then you make the adjustments. And the market, and the financial system is ruthlessly forward-looking. That's what it does best. And if it sees where the world's going, it will want to get there in time. And again, now we are seeing that. Now, lots more needs to be done. Lots more needs to be filled in on regulation. We only have 20% of the world has a carbon price, for example, 20% by GDP. So, and there's lots of subsidies for industries that are not part of the solution. And so much more needs to change, but the dynamic has shifted.
I see lots of questions coming in now. So I'm going to just ask you one last question, which is around the pandemic and the climate crisis. And you've written about them both in your book in this with this framework of values and what COVID demonstrates about our shared values. But perhaps you can comment also a little more broadly on whether you think COVID, what has it done for our behavior around climate? I think we've both remarked that over the 12 months that it's now been a pandemic, action in the climate area has not stopped, at least at a corporate level. And emissions have fallen, although not sufficiently, but they've fallen because we have been flying and traveling less, for example. But there is also a danger that when we come out of the pandemic, we'll, throw caution to the wind and forget about the environment in our euphoria to be let out of our houses, and the companies just begin servicing consumer demands and needs in a different way and forget about this. Or there is an opportunity for a great acceleration and a reset, sort of instigated by our moments of reflection during COVID. So could you just finally comment on those?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in that. I think the first thing is when we finally get out of the pandemic, yes, people are going to consume. They're going to go out for dinner. They're going to travel around the country. They're going to see their friends. They're going to God forbid, go across the channel where it's in the summer, and all these good things, and that's great. The question, and the question is interesting. The question from, sorry, I'm going to answer slightly more than you asked. From an economic perspective, I think the judgments that economic policymakers are making now is the easy bit is the big surge in the economy that happens in the first couple of quarters after lockdowns end and we're allowed back out. The question is how much staying power is there going to be there? From a climate perspective and from an emissions perspective, emissions obviously they're going to bounce back up as we end up lockdown. The question is, how are we reorganizing things so that we live our lives in a way that is fulsome and fulfilling, but also that we're moving to lower and lower emissions over time. Part of that, and this the experience, difficult as it has been over the last year, opens up opportunities on the nature of work and the necessity of certain kinds of business travel and others. I mean, it's just been pounded home to me that I shudder to think how many trips I would have taken in this climate role versus the ease with which these types of interactions happen. That's not to say they're totally eliminated, but they certainly will be greatly reduced. Secondly, I do think that what has happened, maybe I should stop on this point, we'll get to broader questions, but that it's very few companies in this crisis, it is causing a change of strategy for most companies because the world's going to be slightly more fragmented, at least slightly more fragmented, changes in supply chains, the acceleration of digital everything, that changes things. A lot of companies have had to take on a lot of debt. That changes things as well. So strategy is changing. You layer on top of that this core focus on where are you going for net zero, that gets, this is what's happening as we speak, is that a net zero strategy is the need for it is being seen, and that's starting to get oriented into companies' core strategies. And that takes a bit of time to filter through to the economy, but it will filter through to the economy if we continue on the trajectory we are. So I think actually it's a loaded term now, but the strategic reset that COVID has necessitated actually will accelerate the climate transition, even though I'm sure, last point, we will read a bunch of stories, in the first quarter, 2 quarters, which say, oh, emissions went back up. Yeah, emissions, guess what? Emissions are going to go back up initially, but the question is, where are they going over the next few years, and how has the economy been reoriented? Because obviously the solution to climate change is not to shut down our economy.
Thank you. I'm going to pass back now to Vicky, who I think is fielding questions from the audience.
Okay.
I am indeed, and I'm not surprised to see there are an awful lot of questions after such a compelling call to arms and explanation of some of the macroeconomic incentives that we need to put in place, the structures that we need to change. A question I thought I'd start with is about how we can make sure that some of the poorest countries in the world who are probably on target to suffer most from climate change, what can we do for them to make sure that they are not the worst victims of climate change?
Yeah.
I'm going to start with a little piece here, and then I'll pass to Mark, who's probably got a better answer. I've worked a lot in developing countries, and in fact, the reason I moved into climate was because I saw the impact of of climate change on communities in fragile areas, and figured that the best way we can help those places is to get our house in order on climate, and not just to keep sending band-aids over the ocean. So, and I presently work with a foundation that is focused on energy access and trying to enable those countries to sort of leapfrog because you're going from very low penetration of energy, and you don't want them to go through the coal, gas, dirty phase if possible, but you do absolutely need those people to get access to energy. So, and as you say, many of those countries are very fragile, don't have the resources we have to mitigate the effects of climate change, and many are low-lying. You think of Bangladesh, etc. So when we have these discussions around net zero, there is a tendency to focus on the behaviors, plans, and ideas associated with richer countries, which are bigger emitters, obviously have to have more heavy lifting to do in the short term, but not think about a global net zero, which means net zero emissions, throughout the world. And those countries are going to require increasing amounts of assistance from the richer countries to be able to put in place those measures that enable rapid increases in access to energy, but not in a polluting way. And I think one of the challenges for us is that we haven't considered the fact that much of our access to energy was subsidized, at least initially, by governments, and still is in some places. And in those countries, it may be very tiny amounts of money that is required, but people can't afford even the very basic access that they're being offered. So a solar lantern or a solar home system, even that is too much. So we can't ask them to go completely into the markets on this space and hope that we're going to get the outcomes around the sustainable development goals that we wish to. So I do think it requires an ongoing effort, and that's a difficult thing to do now that we have so many calls domestically. But Mark, please add.
I'll be very quick. I agree with all that. The one thing, I was just looking through the questions. Someone asked, what is COP? COP is a good question. It is the conference of the parties. It's 195 countries that have formed basically an agreement to try to address the issue. And the most famous COP, it happens every year. The most famous one is Paris, which was 5 years ago, which is why everyone talks about that objective. And the next one is in Glasgow in November, and it's a big one. It's a key milestone on the process. The only thing I'll say, just to be concrete about the flows to emerging developing economies, there are several. One is there is an agreement in Paris that so-called advanced economies like the UK, Canada will catalyze $100 billion a year to the developing world to support climate mitigation and resilience, so to help them deal with the consequences of climate change. That's the first point. The second is we are working with the World Bank and the other sort of development agencies to ensure that they use their balance sheets, or try to get them to use their balance sheets better, so that what they're doing is they get many more multiples of their balance sheets in private money that goes in, so-called blended finance. And again, it's that order of magnitude. Thirdly, I mentioned something called carbon offsets, which is a bigger subject, but the core point I'll make on that is 90% of the demand for those will come from advanced economy companies, UK, Canadian, US companies. 90% of the supply of those offsets will come from the developing world. And that is a market which is nothing today. It's a couple $100 million for all the noise you hear about it. A proper high integrity market for that, and I can go into boring detail, but important detail about that if anyone wants. That's $100 billion a year market. So 90% of that, $90 billion a year. So there are ways that this system that we're looking to set up actually really ramps up the flows into the emerging and developing world, because well, I'll leave it at that.
So another question which was asked was about how we can incentivize, I suppose, both economically and politically, countries like Brazil, which are home to one of our most precious resources, the rainforest, and also, of course, at the moment, one of the very worrying things that we've been reading about is the emission of methane in the Siberian tundra. So how can we incentivize countries which are home to really critical sort of natural resources like that?
Over to me. Okay, that's fair. First thing is it's part of the value of having as many countries having as high ambition as possible. One of the things, it's important what China committed to in the fall to net zero carbon by 2060. I mean, first major emerging economy to make that commitment. That's important in and of itself because it breaks the sort of advanced emerging split that had been there and shines a light on other major emerging economies. Well, what are you doing? That's first point. And that's part of what the good of COP is to raise ambition, of the whole group. The secondly, in terms of hard incentives, there is a growing desire to pay for what are called nature-based solutions. So actually the rainforest, not just stopping the deforestation, but reforesting some of the rainforest and paying for that and paying for the biodiversity related to that. And it's something that we, the Chinese and others are working on developing. That's the carrot element there. Unfortunately, there is a stick element to this as well over time, which is, and I'm not advocating, I'm observing that that if there's material differences in effort to reduce greenhouse gases, there may be trade restrictions put on so-called border adjustment mechanisms that the European Union and the United States, the new administration of the United States has mused potentially using. Our objective, just to be clear for COP, is to get everyone, to level up, get everyone to high ambition, get the system put in place. So that's not, that becomes on the sidelines. But those are some of the mechanisms.
Thank you, Mark. I've got a question which may be for, perhaps for you, Diana. That when talking about green energy, one of the things you didn't talk about was nuclear power. And one of our participants is wondering to what extent you felt this could be an important part of a move to a zero carbon economy. So
this is obviously a contentious issue and one in which I am not an expert. However, I'm quite happy to opine as a non-expert. My personal view is that we have to keep working on nuclear because the ultimate existential problem is climate and carbon, and we have to think of all possible ways to get to a net zero world, and nuclear may be part of that. Now, I know there are unresolved issues around nuclear waste and there have been nuclear disasters. However, there is a very different strand of nuclear coming up, things called small modular reactors, which are small and modular, so you can kind of move them around, or not move them around, but have them in smaller places, but also which have built-in safety mechanisms such that they can't have these similar types of accidents, and that they can consume some of the waste that we've already produced, the nuclear waste. So while I'm not an expert, and I would recommend on some of the technologies, again, that you read, that people read Bill Gates's book, but there is a very deep need for power capacity to help balance our grids. There are issues of intermittency and seasonality around renewables, which need solving in, either by having higher storage. It's not either or, it's both and. We need better storage, we need different resources, and nuclear could play a very important backstopping role in our energy grids. Now, I recognize that some people find that very difficult. I'm not a zealot on nuclear. However, it is my view that along with another sort of shibboleth out there, which is geoengineering, which is using technologies to block the sun. If we need to keep the window of opportunity open for just a few more years because we haven't got to where we need to be, I personally think it would be crazy not to understand what these technologies could offer to us. So I'm a proponent of continuing to work on them so that we are able to deploy them should we need to.
Thank you very much indeed, Diana. I'm merging a few questions as we go along, you both talked a lot about, some of the structural and systemic changes that are going to have to take place politically and economically. Several participants have asked about, our approach to consumption, perhaps as on an individual level. Does the developed world need a sort of major cultural adjustment to consumption? How do we maintain economic growth when it's rooted in unsustainable consumerism? And I suppose perhaps this bigger question, but what do we see as the kind of future relationship between the state and markets, given all the problems that overblown consumption have caused?
Well, maybe why don't I start in terms of personal consumption? Yeah, obviously it does matter. Our choices, whether it's how we spend our leisure time, what we eat, how we travel, and how we manage our finances. All of those ultimately influence the climate, and all of those can be more or less aligned with the transition that needs to happen. I'm not going to preach, to don't do this, to only do that, but a recognition and for people's personal comfort level and preferences here. But be aware that actually it really does make a difference. And I know from detailed research and actually the marketing plans of some of the world's largest consumer products companies, that there is actually an identifiable, statistically significant consumption pattern by age cohort that actually is driving a shift in the environmental footprint of their products. And to just simplify, the oldest cohort, these are not factors that matter. There is a middle cohort that says it's a factor, but on the margin really isn't. And then there's a younger cohort where it's a defining fact, like the fact is decisive. And so this does matter. And one of the points we're making, and I'll stop on this, Vicky, which is that, and Richard Curtis and others are making this point, which is around making your money matter. And we want to have a system so that everybody on this call, everyone up and down the UK and in Canada, is informed whether their money is being lent out or invested otherwise consistent with the transition. And it's very important that I say consistent with the transition, because what we have to recognize, I think people recognize, is that there's a number of companies, that have large emissions and they're looking to reduce them. And if they are sincerely looking to do that, and they often need money, they need capital in order to do that. And we want our banks, our pension funds, our insurers and others to back them if that is indeed the case. But we as consumers should have a view into that and understand whether my building society account, my pension pot, is invested consistent with a net zero transition to 1.5 degrees. If that's what I value, that's the point. If that's what I value, I should have the information to act on it.
Yeah. Yes, Diana, I wanted to come to you actually, because I know this is something you're really passionate about. What are your thoughts on this idea?
So, I mean, I've actually flip-flopped throughout my environmental career on the relative responsibility of individuals and sort of more structural and corporate responsibility. It would be nice if all the problems could be solved for us and we didn't have to worry about our behaviors. And I think what Mark described earlier on was a world in which many of the products that we're consuming are decarbonized to some, hopefully fully, but gradually decarbonized. We also have, there's at last a renewed emphasis on what's called the circular economy, which is not just recycling, but designing products for kind of disassembly and reuse at the same kind of value level, which reduces our use of primary resources, which are also under stress, as we know, and we can, biodiversity and the destruction of the planet is another issue entirely. But so there are things that are being done such that we'll be able to consume with less guilt, I guess. But there is an argument, there has been an argument, in fact, I'm reading a book at the moment which suggests that the big evil oil companies have kind of blamed us, and it's not really, individuals can't do much about it, and really this is a big company issue, and if we could just fix them, everything would be fine. Again, my view now at this moment in time is it's both and I think we need much more awareness of how our consumption is affecting the world. So there's lots of talk of, for example, sort of GHG labeling on produce, so we know what's good and what's bad, and that will be enabled by companies understanding their supply chains better, and us understanding agricultural supply chains and things like that. So that data is going to be available, and let's hope that consumers can see it and appreciate that more. You know, it's a difficult issue, but clearly, I think on the plus side, all this massive overconsumption, it doesn't make us that happy. So hopefully, the pandemic, if nothing else, has taught us that we can perhaps consume a little less and look for some other delights in life. And I think that, you know, the move towards experiences amongst the younger generation has already proven some of that. So.
I suppose following on from on this theme, several people have asked about what both of you think about carbon pricing as a way of incentivizing more sustainable consumption. And I suppose as a sort of secondary question, what should the British government, you're advising Boris Johnson, Mark, what should the British government be doing in terms of regulation? To what extent should they be putting in place more regulation so that people don't just, as Diana put it, keep passing the buck? What should be what about carbon pricing, and what sort of regulation should the government put in place?
Well, I'll start on that. In terms of a carbon price, it's again, it's one of many tools to help with the transition. It's a very important tool. It's very effective when it is in place. And it allows people to adjust in a variety of different ways, depending on the price. Now, what is necessary, though, with a carbon price is to recognize that it is regressive, by which it means it has a bigger impact on less well-off and the poor than it does on medium to high income people, because carbon is a bigger proportion of their budgets effectively. And so what is being determined is that it's very important to recycle the money to individuals in a transparent way, which is what's done in Canada, which is what Janet Yellen advocates. If they were to do something in the US, that's what she favors. I'm not sure they will do it, but and you can make people whole up to about the 70th percentile of income, so it's quite significant. But the relative price of driving your car, the relative price of something that's carbon intensive, has changed, and that changes behavior and that reduces it. So it's important. It's an important component of it, and I'm certainly an advocate of it, but advocating in a way that's consistent. Look, I think on the and that goes to a general point in terms of regulation, that to the extent possible, one wants to regulate that provides some flexibility in terms of the solution. So you want to regulate a fuel standard for vehicles. Now we reach a point, at some point you do reach a point where you just want to give an absolutely clear signal, and I think we got to that place in the UK on internal combustion engines. So you have a clear signal, clear time frame, and that forces not just the changes in the models, but the changes in the whole infrastructure that's needed around it, charging stations all around, etc., which is the case. In terms of advice for the government, well, I'll save it to give it to the government first. They've taken some of the the advice on board that others have given. There is a need for additional measures will be required in order to meet the 68% down objective, but there will be more climate plans, more budgets, more steps taken, and its absolute last point, I guess, is just to be as clear about the gap that remains between the objective and the measures that have been taken, so that, again, we all understand how that it needs to be filled, and then the best ideas come in to fill those. I know that sounds like I'm avoiding the question, but that's because I am, actually.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm just looking at the time, and I think we might have time for one more question, if that's okay. Somebody's asked about whether there really is the political will to make sure that we do make progress on climate change. And I suppose to sort of Diana's introductory comments, is there the political will, and do we think that that can be galvanized and marshaled and systematized in time? As you say, potentially we've only got a decade.
So I'm going to start, and then I'm going to give Mark the last word because he's wiser on this. But, you know, so as someone who's been in this space for a while, seems to me obvious that there is not sufficient political will. There are some very obvious things that are taking place now that shouldn't be taking place. And I noticed someone pointed out the new coal mining plant in the UK, and there are examples in Canada. We have this big tension obviously around the oil sands, etc. And there are things that either exist or even are being newly introduced that clearly are not compatible with a net zero future. So it's hard to argue that governments that oversee that have the political will. I think that what is interesting is the Biden administration coming in, they have a much more whole of government. They appear to have a much more whole of government approach to climate. So they're really thinking about every aspect of their work through a climate lens. Now they have a lot of heavy lifting to do around behavior. So let's see what happens when they come to implementing. But there is an example where it feels a bit more joined up, the thinking. But the last thing I'll say about political will is, you know, my personal viewpoint is that the problem over the years is that governments have kind of said, well, people don't really want us to do this. They're not voting for us to do this. They're not agitating. They're not changing their behavior. So because we're responsive to people, we kind of can't do anything in this space. We don't have the mandate to do things that could have a short-term cost to the economy. May not, but could. And people have thought, well, if the problem's really, really bad, surely the government will be doing something about this, because, you know, we've heard about this. It seems terrible, but that's what governments do. They save us from our biggest problem. So surely that, you know, either the problem isn't that bad or the government have got some cunning plan up their sleeve, so they're doing it. And there's a bit of kind of standoff between people and governments, and neither side has really got going. My hope is that now that has actually been broken. But that's why I would counsel that we need both individual action and government action and corporate action. We need everyone to get into a self-reinforcing loop. And yes, we do need to vote on this. And yes, we do need to show that we are prepared to take some small hits to the way we operate and behave in our lives, and kind of license our governments to take some bigger steps, some of which are going to be positive. I mean, there are more jobs in clean tech than there are in dirty tech now. So there are, as Mark has said before, opportunities. But I would say if you just looked at the evidence, no, the political will is not where it needs to be yet, but it is definitely ramping up. And with that, I shall pass over to my husband.
Well, I'm not sure I have anything to add. I'll just reinforce maybe that point, which is that I think we all know where we need to get to, which was not as obvious 5 years ago or 7 years or 8 years ago. I mean, net zero wasn't a mainstream concept. It is now. We increasingly have the information. We can judge whether something's on the trajectory, whether it's a country or company or a pool of capital, and to hold to account whether steps are being made. I do agree that in general, politicians have, in many countries, virtually all countries, have horribly lagged the population on this, which has had a feedback to tell people that it wasn't as big of an issue maybe as it was. It's now painfully obvious that it is as big an issue and that time is limited, and it requires political leadership. And just to finish with a commercial for COP26 in Glasgow in November, that's the objective of the UK for COP26, which is, to show UK leadership, which I do think the country is doing, both on an individual and country level, and bring the world along to the highest possible ambition. And we should be judged on what's actually delivered at COP and the Conference of the Parties. What are the plans ambitious enough? Is the core of the financial system lined up for net zero and ready and committed to that? And we need the political side to lead on that. But ultimately, everyone who's devoted a chunk of their evening, and thank you for doing so, to to scrutinize and judge and impact. And then, of course, for this final point, the students of the GDST to come in and finish the job once they graduate.
We never was there a better call to arms. Students of the GDST need to get onto this. And one of them, Natasha, who's one of our A-level economists, is going to say a few comments to close the evening.
Hi, so I would just like to say, on behalf of the student body, thank you so much to you both for such an interesting and thought-provoking talk. Kind of seems in this day and age that there's quite a common narrative that economic development necessarily comes at an environmental cost. And it was very inspiring to hear that this is not necessarily the case. They aren't mutually exclusive. And I was particularly struck by what you said on shifting focus from seeing emissions reducing policies as risks to seeing them as opportunities for investment. And this seems to hold a lot of hope that change will be enacted in time. And I also found your mention of public action and pressure on businesses to adopt more climate-friendly policies very interesting, particularly since you identified it seems that this burden is going to fall a lot to my generation, but with pioneers such as yourselves leading the way, it's given me a lot of hope that we as a whole will be equal to this challenge. So once again, thank you so much for such an inspiring talk. And I'll now hand you back to Mrs. Bingham.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And it just remains for me to thank everybody for joining us, and of course to thank Diana and Mark for giving us such a compelling and such a cogent call to arms, an account of some of the political and economic changes that need to happen in the next decade, so that all of you and your children and grandchildren can live in a world which is not at risk from the sort of catastrophic effects of climate change. It's been incredibly interesting, and I urge all of us who've heard the talk this evening to go out there, to ask the questions, to scrutinise, so that we are not, those of us who care, as Diana put it, voices in the wilderness. That just can't happen. And I hope you'll all be watching what happens with the COP26 Climate Change Summit in Glasgow in November this year. But thank you once again, Mark and Diana. We are absolutely privileged to have had you with us this evening. And thank you for joining us, everybody.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Vicky.